Afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and welcome to my talk, and I look forward to our question and answer period. The theater is historically known as the seeing place, and a sightline, an unobstructed view, or an expanded vision is an important consideration in theater practice. From a technical point of view, one of my jobs as a director is to ensure that I tell the story in ways that allow for actors and witnesses to be seen by one another. However, from an aesthetic perspective, my signature style is to tell a story in ways that deepen our intervisibility. That is, our ability to see the spirit of a play in ways that will help us better understand our realities. In my 10 years of service to William & Mary, I've operationalized the possibilities for African American theater and Black theater on its own merits beyond tokenism, and have brought the institution and the local community together through the process of building a performance-based research program of African American theater and Black theater, both on and off the main stage, informed by the highest possible standards in pedagogy and practice. In my teaching and research with students, I affirm the premise of Black theater as a performance strategy rooted in social and spiritual practices of the African diaspora. Thus, when I'm reading a play, I'm always listening for the drums in the text, not literal drums, but the cultural metalanguage, the life-giving, spirited, dynamic forces embedded within the play that are influencing subtly or otherwise the reality of the text. Black cultural critics have called for a distinct social and sacred algorithm in Black theater since the early 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first to codify principles of Black theater that served as a springboard for all other ethical premises, opined that Black theater should be by, for, about, and near Black people. In 1927, Alain Locke posited that the development of Negro dramatic art could not be thought of without some significant artistic re-expression of African life. In his 1965 essay, The Revolutionary Theater, Amiri Baraka wrote, "Theater should isolate the ritual in historical cycles of reality." In 1968, Larry Neal asserted that his artistic re-expression could be called through a separate symbolism, mythology, critique, and iconology, a position which clearly manifested in the God-conscious art of Dr. Barbara Ann Teer, who founded the National Black Theater in that same year, 1968. In 1971, Ron Milner told us that the Black theater must go home, that it must undergo a psychic, mental, aesthetic, and physical migration back to Africa. With the drama of Nomo, 1972, and Kuntu drama, 1974, Paul Carter Harrison argued for the need to move beyond the convention of realism in Black theater towards a mode that connected us with Africa and released the transformative wisdom of African expressivity retained in the collective, albeit diverse, experience of the African diaspora. In Kuntu drama, he tells us that directors of Black theater must prepare themselves with knowledge of corresponding African and African American mythologies and be able to discern the motivating responses of Black people to certain rhythms within a text, i.e. the play's gestures, symbols, and real or energetic connections to spiritual reference. In 2019, this pronouncement of the need for a clear aesthetic ideology in Black theater continued to be heard in Dominique Taylor's "Don't Call African American Theater Black Theater, It's Like Calling a Dog a Cat." In this essay, he reminds us that one of the key differences between Black theater and African American theater is that in Black theater, spirit is not ancillary to the physical world. It is a vital, shaping cultural force. In this thinking, Taylor and all the others that I've cited here are working from the line of thought offered by scholar John Mbiti, author of African Religions and Philosophies, in which he posits traditional religions, permeate all the departments of life. There is no formal distinction between the sacred and secular, between religious and non-religious, between spiritual and material areas of life. These are some of the ethics of the tradition which inform my direction and the aesthetic interests my work has moved towards more clearly in the past 6 years. For me, this preparation, which began with my first professional full-length production, Etchings of Soul Women by Denise Odom, began to crystallize during my participation in the 2014 National Endowment for the Humanities Institute, Black Aesthetics and African-Centered Cultural Expressions, Sacred Systems in the Nexus Between Cultural Studies, Religion, and Philosophy. I was one of 25 scholars selected via a competitive process to study with Harrison, the late Pelham McDaniels III, and a host of other intellectual luminaries on developing a critical language for evaluating Black art. Through this experience and later ethnographic and embodied study of Isheshe Fa and some of its diasporic formations, a frame emerged, giving my work a little more depth and texture. Working in the spirit of Bantu drama, or creating work through indigenous traditions, I primarily use the iconography, orature, and ritual of Yoruba cosmology as a cultural location from which to source performance strategies that give illumination to the play's interior world. Because of the openness of Isheshe Fa and its well-documented archive, Yoruba cosmology and philosophy are one of the primary ways that I read and illuminate the rhythms in a text or performance. In my direction, I work with collaborators to bring both the spiritual and the corporal together through costuming, lights, sound, scenography, or dance, gesture, and movement as appropriate and as the resources and abilities of my designer colleagues allow. This aggregate conceptualization of the world, the spiritual and corporal, is also a foundational or fundamental tenet in my approach towards teaching character study in my directorial process with my students. I engage actors in a study of Yoruba cosmology, and it doesn't have to be Yoruba, it could be any African cosmological system. That's just the one that I choose, in order to help them develop a performance strategy by giving them an archive of aesthetics and values to reference to understand the behavioral motivations, an archetype through which to understand their character, and a means of understanding how the character's external desires are shaped by or are in harmony with not only the elevated self, but also the needs of the community to which the character belongs. Thus, most every play I direct moves beyond entertainment or art imitating life and harkens back towards theater's roots in religion and rites to appease the gods. Theater, and my work specifically, is a ritual, and my students ceremonial officiants capable of manipulating and regulating forces through performance to, as Paul Carter Harrison would say, illuminate the path toward epiphany for the characters and bring revitalization to the individual and the community within the world of the play, as well as those in the seeing place, bearing witness to the work. Just yesterday, playwright Dominique Morisseau said to all of us at the Black Theater Network conference, Radical Longevity, that, and I quote her here, "I believe in our wellness. We are in the business of wellness, whether we know it or not. Theater artists are in the business of wellness making. We're bringing people together inside of spaces who would not normally sit next to each other. And we're asking them to go on a ride, an emotional journey together, or a cerebral journey together. And in my favorite ones, both. To have an experience that is hopefully going to move a conversation forward," end quote. Like Morisseau, I feel deeply purposed in my work of creating opportunities, rituals, for people to get well, to be in good standing with the self, to recover what was lost, to be free through storytelling. I tell my students that theater is like honey to a warring force. Alone, it may not eradicate social ills, but it can offer perspectives that bring balance to malevolent forces and adversaries of goodness within the world, and elevate our cultural consciousness in ways that strengthen our resolve and commitment to imagining a new world. And when I began my journey into Isheshefa, which is a West African cultural and spiritual practice, and I sat on the mat, as we say in the tradition, to make sense of the drama of my own humanity and remember or put back the pieces of the contract that I made with myself as to how I would live this life. One of the very last things said to me was, there are many stories to tell. Tell stories in your writing, tell stories in your plays, tell stories, and all good things will come to you. The pedagogical rationale for my research and teaching in theater through an Africanist lens is that it introduces, or in some cases expands, the dramaturgical acumen of my students beyond what is traditionally taught in theater programs, equipping them with additional cultural literacies to draw upon in the analysis and creation of art and scholarship. And it cultivates a future generation of performers and critics capable of shaping Black expressive culture and influencing Black performance practice and dramatic criticism. Yet the personal rationale for approaching my research and teaching in this way is rooted in something that my maternal grandmother, Dorothy Minor, told me. She said, let your work be a testament of who you are at your core, and don't compromise for what others want to see. When I think back to all of what has shaped me at my core, it was all forged in a kiln of Black expressivity and the embedded episteme and cultural codes in Black popular music and gospel, watching Black women perform spiritual labor or ushering in the spirit, bringing in the word that transforms people and circumstances. It was the cultural episteme embedded in The Wiz, Alex Haley's Roots, the autobiography of Malcolm X, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon and Beloved, or the movies Beach Street, Electric Boogaloo, and the television program A Different World. The first live play I saw in the Seeing Place was Oliver at the Queen's Theater in 1986. I was 9, and I was moved by the transformation that occurs when people can relate to a story's themes of shared humanity, an actor's commitment in storytelling, and the resourcefulness of the theater itself and how the world of the play is created on stage. However, the first play that I read for Colored Girls, a dramatic choreo poem by Ntozake Shange, was given to me by my maternal grandmother when I was in my early teens. Some of my friends told me that this was a book you needed to have, she said. Of course, now I wonder, who were these friends who knew I needed the book? And I can think of reasons why all of her granddaughters could have benefited from reading the play, but she only gave it to me. Why? But what she gave me was a mirror, a reminder of who I am, a manual on how to move to the end of one's own personal storms, and a baptism into a vernacular, literary, and performative tradition that was beautiful and mine. What my grandmother, mother, and father gave to me is what I endeavor to give to all of my students: a love of culture, a love of self, an understanding that they are part of a continuum with a cultural inheritance, and a desire to go back and get it if they don't already have it. When I turn the worn pages of For Colored Girls, I am reminded of the day that I sat in Professor Susan Chast and Professor Hermine Penson's class on African American theater history and performance at what we then called the College of William and Mary. And I decided that I was not going to law school, but that I would pursue theater. When I turn the pages of that text, I'm reminded of all the times I was subsequently told in one way or another that I would not be able to make a career of Black theater, that it was limiting. Even when I began my career here at William and Mary, hired as the African American theater historian, I was told by a colleague, you know, you don't have to limit yourself to only Black plays. So when I think about that, and I think about my undergraduate and even my graduate experiences, I realize that what we're telling young people and young Black, Indigenous scholars and artists of color specifically, when we tell them not to develop scholarship and art in the traditions of their lived experience, that there's no value in majoring or minoring in theater or Africana studies or any of the people-based global studies programs, or that they should not embrace identity-based praxis and pedagogy, is that you cannot be yourself, that you cannot make a creative or intellectual home within your humanity. And that's not true. Playwright August Wilson said, I write about the Black experience in America, and contained within that experience, because it is a human experience, are all the universalities, the things that are common to all cultures. So like Wilson, through the specifics of the life that I know best, I contribute to the academic life of William and Mary by showing Black, Indigenous students of color the importance of centering their humanity, and by affirming that they absolutely can personalize their scholarship and make a career of doing so, by teaching all students about emotional and critical literacy and how to tell stories, their own or someone else's, with competence and confidence, and by holding space, be that in a classroom or the seeing place, for students and witnesses who desire to see themselves in the sightlines of scholarship and cultural production, for students who desire to craft images of their humanity in ways that help others see them with depth, and for all of those who need a little honey for the warring forces of life, who need liberation, agency, wellness, and affirmation of value. Thank you.
So Omiyemi, Steve here, in case your boxes aren't lining up. I'm going to go ahead and post to chat the link we were talking about that gives people a little more information about your professional background. I wondered when I was listening to you, thanks by the way for that great talk, it's kind of inspiring to me. You were talking about listening for the drums, for the rhythms of the drums, when you were thinking about your work. And I'm wondering if you can describe how there's intellectual knowledge, but this is bigger than this. This is deeper, more intuitive maybe. How do you help students understand how they can do that as part of acting in a show you're directing?
So that's why it's important to first give them the critical frame as a way of reading a text. So for myself, because I'm operating intuitively, for my students, I first give them the frame and ask them to read the play through that frame to see if they can see the things that I see. So I work intuitively, but I ask them to first read intellectually, right? And then after we've done that a couple of times, then they begin to pick it up automatically. They'll take it from something like reading the plays of August Wilson in the American Century Cycle and take that same frame and be able to pick up on it instantly in the work of Katori Hall, in the work of Dominique Morisseau, right? So it becomes a way of practice in everything that they're reading, be it in the canon of African American theater or Black theater. And because they then have a frame, they're able to distinguish between the two, right? What is actually Black theater, which is rooted in indigenous Africanist practices, versus African American theater, which is not.
So I want to encourage everyone who's listening to please post any questions you might have for Omiyemi in the chat. Gerald's going to walk us through those questions in a minute. But I have another question for you now. So, okay, the students have the frame. You've taught them the frame. They're learning how to read in this context.
Mm-hmm.
How does that turn into acting? And then how does their acting reach the audience?
Because as I was explaining in the paper, I use a cosmological approach towards acting, right? So I ask the students to see their characters by way of archetypes, cosmological archetypes, that then keep them from emoting, getting into what it means to be human, and sometimes getting into, just from a really practical perspective, being on stage and wanting to be seen in all of their full glory. They understand if they're focusing on their work through the perspective of an archetype and that the work is a ritual, then they have a job, and that is to make the ritual efficacious, to make it purposeful, to move the action in a particular way that's going to achieve a particular outcome, that's going to restore something to the community and to the individual. So it becomes more about the ritual and less about, ooh, I'm on stage, I'm seen, I look good in my costume. No, this is ritual work that we're doing here.
And can the audience perceive that difference? Does it make a real difference in how the actors connect?
It makes a difference in how the actors connect. That's when the post-show conversation becomes critical, so that I can then explain to the witnesses what they've just experienced. I like creating events. So whatever context we can give audiences before they see a show of mine, and whatever I can clarify on the back end of that is always really helpful. And then those that follow me or follow my work or follow the journey of my students, if I've had the pleasure of working with them since they were freshmen until they become seniors, it becomes noticeable.
Gerald, do we have any questions that you're...
Yes, we do. Actually, I'm going to ask one, because before we get to that, because when you were talking about that, Omiyemi, about the post-show wrap-up and chance for conversation, it reminded me of Dance of the Orcas last year. I had an honor of attending, and the choreo ritual of dance and music and prose, and the emphasis within that of being replenished by water.
Yes.
In our conversations in the past, the analogus of water and reflection. Can you talk a little bit more about that in relation to Dance of the Orcas, but also your work as a professor?
Absolutely. So Dance of the Orcas, it was a ritual that I wrote in response to the orca Tahlequah from 2017, I believe, who lost her baby and then pushed her baby through the ocean, the Pacific Northwest, for 17 days. It was a journey of 1,000 miles. And I watched, when I started noticing the journey, it was probably day 2. And what was striking to me was the way the women, the other orcas, gathered around and supported her in the pushing through of what was a very difficult situation for her to let go of. And it made me think of all of what I, as a woman, had been holding on to in my life and had not let go of, even in my 40s. And so I began to write, and write specifically about what happens when you don't let go of the trauma, when you don't work through it and let go of it, and how it turns into disease in the body, which is very much what I was literally struggling with at that time in my life, which ultimately ended up requiring me to take medical leave for the spring of 2019. And so the story is very much about how a young woman watching Tahlequah go through her own journey at the beach is advised to undertake a similar journey. And in doing so, she goes, through this ritual of an experience with forces of nature that compel her to travel deep into the ocean of herself. And in doing so, she comes into contact with a cultural consciousness and an opportunity to release and let some things go by way of the water. This was performed as part, as you know, as part of the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora Conference. I had the pleasure of performing for all of those guests who came to William and Mary last fall. I was able to collaborate with Christopher Newport University on this work and bring in a lot of what I had discovered in my journey in studying Isheshe Ifa and its diasporic formations across the world in Cuba and Brazil and Nigeria. And so it was a way for me to sort of bring all of those things together and involve my students in that work.
Yes, very powerful, and it's exciting to hear when we were talking earlier that the plans are the spring show 2021, hopefully.
Yes.
The Dance of the Orcas will return to.
Yes, absolutely.
So everyone stay tuned on the calendar when that happens, because it was a powerful and special evening. So I'm glad it will return. So we have questions coming in. The first one that came in from Clarissa asking, please repeat your grandmother's advice. Let your work.
Yes.
What was your grandmother's background?
Yes. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she was a nurse. She took care of people by way of the medical profession. And her advice was to let your work be a testament of who you are at your core, and do not compromise for what anyone wants to see. She had a way with words. For sure.
Writing it down. It's very
for sure.
applies to all of us. We've had another question. We read a quote from Du Bois in which he said that the Black theater needs to be near Black people. Theater is a space under threat because of the pandemic, like so many industries.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to create that space now. And is there a chance of actually democratizing that theater into the future because of the pandemic?
Okay, so the first part of the question was, is there a way of?
The best way to create that space now with the living under the pandemic.
Yeah, so first of all, we are living theater every day. As human beings, we are always negotiating the drama of the human condition. Tell stories. That's the best way to do it now. Tell stories in your family. Tell stories to each other. If there's a story that you've been holding on to, you need to write it. You don't need to wait for someone to give you permission or someone to give you an opportunity. The story is yours, and so tell it and share it. The way theater works at its core is that there needs to be someone to witness and someone doing the telling. So if there are two people in a space, theater is happening. So that's the best way to do it right now, is to not allow the pandemic to stop us from telling stories, first and foremost. And that's for all of us, whether it's Black theater or any other theatrical style. And then the second part of the question was about democratizing.
Right. Is there a chance of actually democratizing that theater into the future because of the pandemic?
There's always a chance, right? If we're storytellers and we're working with institutions, and we're committed to doing our work, just like I am committed to telling, to engaging in Black theatrical performance strategies, then I'm committed to demonstrating to my colleagues, by way of the literature and by the way of the work of my students, that it's something that needs to be done. And so I'm going to do it. I'm going to convince them of the validity of doing it. And I'm going to do it whether they're convinced of the validity of that or not, because it's important work to be done, because I've seen how it's changed my life, the life of my students. And it's part of my own spiritual cultural contract, right? And so regardless of the style, as I was saying in the close of my talk, there are universalities, even in points of specificity. We can all learn something from each other, regardless of the modes that we choose to work in.
I was thinking also about wherever we are, a theater where in this time of self-quarantine and being at home, those stories really give you that opportunity with family that you're with that you might not normally be with, or the phone call or Zoom.
Absolutely.
To provide those stories that we've never had those opportunities before in some cases.
And I think that now that everyone is working, the beautiful thing I realized about participating in the Black Theater Network conference yesterday was that we now have audiences in our conferences and in performances that we give by way of Zoom that had not been present in the scene places, right? The brick and mortar places where we were doing our work, where we were charging people and making them park and get dressed up and come in and sit down. And now we can make it widely available to most everyone that has particular technological privileges. Yes, there's still some privilege, there's still technology, and not everybody has access to it. But what I'm noticing in the things that I've chosen to participate in by way of Zoom is that more people have access than they did before.
True.
So that's a way of democratizing it, so to speak, right? You can get more accessible, allowing more people who weren't able to participate in it before, they now can.
Exactly. We've had a question from Suzanne. She's asked, can you give an example of, quote, the frame, unquote?
Sure. So a good example would be Gem of the Ocean. And when I discovered that Wilson writes from a dramaturgical perspective, the way he structures that play is very much structured by an African conceptualization of time, right? So each critical moment in the play, the plot there is very much structured around, the way I read it by way of a Yoruba lens, is very much structured around optimal days for achieving certain goals, right? And so as opposed to simply just, there is a stasis, the world is happening, something interrupts the stasis, now we have conflict, now we have rising action, now we have a climax, now we have falling action in the denouement. I mean, that's how we teach our students how to read the play, from a Western perspective. There's that because he was trained in the dramaturgy of the West. But when you have a diasporic lens and you know something about how other cultures view time and how the relationship from an Africanist perspective is very much integrated, the spiritual and the corporal, then you understand I need to be looking for something else in this text. I need to move beyond this Western frame because something else is happening here. And because you've read a bit, you've traveled a bit, you've studied a bit, you've expanded your mind culturally so that you have other critical frameworks, cultural frameworks to draw upon to talk about that work, as opposed to just telling my students, oh, okay, so, let's follow this dramatic pyramid here. I was able to say, okay, you could do that. And now I'm also going to teach you about the Kajoda, right? And this is what Sunday means. And this is what Monday means. And this is what happens on Tuesday and why Aunt Esther does all her work on Tuesday, right? So then they go, aha, every time they see Tuesday, I'm telling y'all something here. So when y'all go back and read these plays, you understand, okay, why Aunt Esther is only doing these soul washings on Tuesday across the whole cycle, not just Gem of the Ocean. But it was Gem of the Ocean where I first discovered it. And I have since been applying that methodology of an ethnocultural dramatic structure. That's what I call it. That's my theory. That's how I published under it. I have been applying that to the other plays. Yes.
Another
That's
powerful,
an example of the frame.
another powerful performance last February when that work of love to debut the Gem of the Ocean on William Mary Theater then too. So
Yes, I have been wanting to direct that play for some time. And, I was so proud of the way the students rallied around making sure that we can make that work happen. It's a pretty large cast, and it's not always easy to do the work of African American theater or Black theater here on campus, just because we don't always have the bodies, right? Our students are, they're really smart. They're deeply engaged in the life of campus. And sometimes there's just multiple competing things happening. And so, but the students were insistent that this work was gonna happen, and they made it happen.
and thank goodness it was just a few weeks before
Yes.
there at the end of February. So
Oh my goodness, unfortunately we weren't able to finish our season, but I was happy that I got in there before before things fell apart.
Well, DeLorean has asked a question about explaining the major difference between African American theater and Black theater.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of times with Black theater, if you go and take a look on in that essay, that I cited by Dominique Taylor, which is online, one of the things he makes clear is that oftentimes African American theater is produced by predominantly white institutions. It's produced by predominantly white institutions for predominantly white audiences without any intention to involve the community in the creation of the work or any distinct way of speaking, to their particular cultural experience, right? Another distinction is that it lacks, and this is a lot of what my talk was about, DeLorean, is that the work itself, African American theater, lacks those cultural codes. It lacks that indigenous episteme that you can locate in East Africa or West Africa or South Africa, right? The cultural retentions are very much there. An example would be how we might read, and I give this example all the time because, Paul Carter Harrison, he's a genius, and he said it so distinctly. A good example would be something like For Colored Girls. You read that play, you see, first of all, it's not even structured. It's not even structured, right, in the dramaturgy of the West. Each of those plays are contextual. Each of those poems, excuse me, are contextual. They can stand on their own, right? It includes African-American vernacular English. You see the emotional arc. You see how music is moving the story forward. You see at the end of the choreo poem, how they're talking about the divinity within this individual, right? You're talking about that cultural practice that Black women engage in when we come together and we lay hands on one another, and the power of our afoshe, our ability to command and bring something into existence by way of our words, to heal by way of our words, to heal by way of touch. And we can talk about that in the context of Africanist practices. You might read something, let's say, in a play. Let me give a good example here. Ruined. I did that here at William and Mary. So while that play itself is set in the Democratic Republic of Congo, structurally, that play doesn't have that indigenous cultural code embedded in the structure of the work at all, right? The audience focus is very different. In fact, the playwright goes as far to say originally when she was writing the work, she first thought that she was going to tell the story of these women who were suffering and of the people who were suffering through the Civil War within the country by way of Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage. So her original instinct was to couch the story of these Black people, these African people, in, a play, that was written outside of their tradition, right? And then she realized in the process of talking to them, that she could not do that, right? That these women needed to be able to tell their story, and they needed it to, that needed to be the focus in whatever work that she was going to write, right? However, the audience for that work, it wasn't Black people. That wasn't the focus, right? The story is about how the West is complicit in that ongoing war within the country. It's an internal war over the wealth of the land, but the focus, the audience focus, are the people who are continuing to fuel that war internally, right? So the difference, one of the key differences between African American theater and Black theater is who the work is for. So when I say that W.E.B. Du Bois says that Black theater is by, for, about, and near, a lot of what we might be seeing from Black people on Broadway may not be classified as Black theater just because Black artists are writing the work. It's not necessarily near the people. It's not necessarily for the people. You got to look at who's around you when you're watching these plays, like who's actually sitting in the seat. And you must always, when trying to discern the difference between the two, really look for the cultural code.
That's very helpful. Thank you. We have another question from Jamar. Can you expand upon what led you to select Yoruba as part of your teaching practice? Is there a specific moment that was a aha for you?
Wow. So let's say, maybe I'll use Joe Turner. Yeah. It would be Jamar to ask me this question. I'm gonna use I'm gonna use Joe Turner's Come and Gone, which is August Wilson's second play in the American Century Cycle. We did that play too here at William and Mary, and it was definitely a spiritual journey for everybody involved. At the crux of the story, when I first read it as an undergraduate, I thought it was about a man looking for his wife. And when I came back to the story and was now teaching it to my students and directing it on stage, I realized that it has nothing to do with this man looking for his wife. In fact, this man was looking for himself. He's looking for his song. He's looking for his purpose. He's looking for his identity. And he goes through a self-baptism in this work that is ultimately an initiation into his purpose. And when I was participating in the NEH Summer Institute and working with Paul, my mentor, Paul first said to me that even Wilson himself, when he initially wrote it, didn't realize that he was tapping into the mythology of Ogun, which is the energy of iron and the spirit of, war and technology and industrialization and strength and courage. And that oftentimes people would ask Wilson what was happening in that moment of the play, and he would say, I don't know, but you should call Paul, because the way Paul explains it makes a lot of sense. Even I didn't know what I was getting into. And so when Paul explained that to me, I started looking more closely at Yoruba cosmology, because Ogun is one of the many energies, forces of nature that are within that particular system. And so that led me on my own personal journey. I'd like to think that just like Harold Loomis, I went on my own spiritual journey, which then led me to, becoming an Oberisha, and later on, becoming a priest, as I am now in this particular system. And so it was the art that certainly led me there. It wasn't just Joe Turner, although that may have been the first. Regina Taylor's Crowns, that particular play, that playwright uses very intentionally Yoruba cosmology as a structural device in that work. And so in trying to make sense of that device, and again, teach it to my students, I have found that when I'm trying to teach something, to my students, I also have to go on the same journey that I'm asking them to go on, right, in order to make sense of the work. And so in doing so, I just was pulled further and further and further along, Jamar. And so here we are.
Well, we've had a question from Kim related to that. How does one combine their spiritual, cultural contract with their profession, especially when most professions are aligned with problematic and often racist systems?
Oh dear. Well, Kim, I consider myself blessed. One, as I said in my earlier comments, when I sat on the mat for myself, what I was already doing was affirmed, right? So I was already on my path. I was already fulfilling my destiny. But then I also, for myself, have made the personal commitment that I've made the personal commitment that the way I'm gonna sustain myself is to bring all of these aspects of my life together wherever I am, because that's Africanist. That is how it works. So even if I find myself in a hostile place, engaging with individuals who don't see my humanity, that because I have my ancestors, that because I know that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, that I'm fulfilling my personal contract, I stand on that ground, and that's what I use to move me forward in everything that I do, because I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. There's more to that, and you and I can talk offline when we're not doing this. But that's the answer that'll work for this environment.
Naona has asked a question: what advice can you give for someone who's undergoing that phase of finally seeing their self, as you did with reading Natsuki Sanja's Four Color Girls, and for the phase once you have newly embraced your authentic self?
So it's Intozaki Shange for Color Girls. And the question is, what advice would I give for someone who's now seeing themselves as I did when I saw that work?
Right.
Well, and you don't have to answer this question here because you can't, but then of course I would ask you, what is it that you see? Right? What do you see now? And if there are things that you see about the self that you want to change, then okay, let's start there. We have a motivating action. We have an action item, right? We can work on changing those things. And if there are things that you see about yourself that are affirmed in the work, then that's a beautiful thing. And that's what I hope every play that I ask my students to read, right? That it does that for them. I pick plays with intention. Sometimes I wait to see who's going to show up on the roll. And then I'm like, oh, okay, I know this person or two. So now I'm going to include this play, right? And many times it's based on intuition. This is what we need in this semester. I need to take this one off and add this one, right? So that I can create this kind of journey of self-discovery for my students. That's what I think every college experience should do. It should be a journey of self-discovery. It should lead you to loving yourself. It should lead you to being your authentic self. It should lead you to being more courageous and less fearful and willing to step out and put into action all of these things that you've been thinking about and writing about for some time now. It should help develop your character, your fortitude, your ability to be resilient. If these are areas in which you're struggling, then college is still good, right? Because now we know these are things I need to fix, right? But because I'm teaching from largely an Africana perspective in everything I do, my MO always, especially for Black, Indigenous students and scholars and artists of color who sit in my classes, to be affirmed that this thing that we've inherited, that we are a part of, is splendid. That there is so much out here for us to learn about ourselves, that we have a tradition that is worth bearing, that is worth embedding, that is worth embodying in all that we do.
Well, I'm looking at the clock. Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, and we could keep on going. I feel like we're just getting started here, Omiyemi.
We probably are.
But we have gone through all the questions here, and one phrase you talked about, the theater of being the business of wellness making.
Yes.
Such an important thing for all of us in this time that we're in now of wellness making, and you've really helped us today in our growth and healing and wellness making, and in your inspirational words today, and your career and research as a scholar at William & Mary. So we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes. We
I
hope-
really do. Thank you for everybody coming to sit and listen, and I appreciate you, giving of your time today in this way. And I hope that something I've shared has been meaningful, to you for sure.
Yes, I've written down many points here, so I've some notes. So many points of meaningfulness. So thank you. Tim, turn it back to you for any final announcements before we adjourn for the afternoon.
Yeah, I can't say thank you enough, Omiyemi. That was fantastic. Just looking at the chat here, it looks like everyone wants a part 2, so we might have to start thinking about scheduling for that. But we will be sending out a survey tomorrow, so we'd love to get your feedback beyond what's already in the chat. See what you want to, what kind of programs you want to see in the future, and how we can best provide those. So thank you all for joining, and have a great afternoon.